Hello and welcome to a new Cabbie Conversations. I'm here with my good friend James, as always.
Hello.
James, when you were younger, what's the biggest lie you were told, or what's the biggest misconception you used to have?
I think my favorite is thinking that basically if a mouse ate enough food, it would turn into a rat. Because it just would keep growing and it would turn into a rat.
So they were like the same species. I
Yeah,
love
but
that.
like a rat was like a mega class of mouse. It was the mega mouse, i.e. the rat.
It's the Pokemon evolution, like you leveled it up enough.
Yeah.
Like that's funny. For me, it
Um,
was that essentially it was that, well, there's a few things. I used to think that a lot of like fictional characters were real, especially if it was like live action stuff, but also sometimes with cartoons as well. I used to think Family Guy was real. They were real people. This is when I was much younger.
I didn't necessarily think that they were real people, but I did wonder if the places were real, like Elwood
Yeah.
City and Arthur. I used to wonder, was Elwood City real? And what's it? Springfield and The Simpsons is real. It is a
Yeah.
real place. I googled that because I want. um,
Yeah.
but I didn't think that I didn't think there was an interplay between the cartoon world and the human world, but I did think that like the story of Tracy Beaker, that was some real shit.
Yeah, me too. Because especially when they deal with like real problems and stuff. I also used to
Um,
think that in games that basically, even if it was like a single player game, all the other characters in the game were played by somebody else. Like, even if they were just standing there doing nothing for like 20 hours, it's like, oh, someone must be logging on to play. I don't know, some stupid like,
like even the character that was there to tell you, you have reached the special
yeah.
gate.
Imagine if that was your job. It's like, God, that was so boring.
Oh my, well,
Um,
that's what it's like to be like a tour guide or something. You have reached.
yeah, exactly. Um, uh, I just think it's funny. It's like imagine if you played like a 20-year-old game. It's like someone has to be sat there waiting for someone to log on. It's just like, oh, fine. Someone's playing Tony Hawk again, like 20 years after it came out. Fucking get on there again. Have to pretend to stand in the corner and give them quests.
Who the fuck logged on? I can't be bothered with this today. I've moved on to better things.
Yeah. But,
um,
go on.
what else did I think? I used to get things mixed up, so I thought that being psychic, so like being able to predict the future, was the same as a sidekick, like Robin and was in Robin and Batman.
Because they sounded similar.
Yeah.
Oh, oh, that's cute.
um, and the other thing was that I used, like the mortal fear when somebody said that if you held like a scowl, your face would be a scowl, or when the wind changed, or if you ate like because if you ate like an apple seed or an orange pip or
Oh
something, that
yeah,
was
classic.
it was gonna grow out your body, and you was gonna the absolute terror the first time it happened, and then like obviously it didn't happen, and you were just like, when is this?
I just feel like you look back and you think like, well, I'm pretty sure you'd see on the news that people they would put it all over the packaging or something. If imagine if like a seed could kill you that easily.
I mean, although like apple seeds do have like a trace of arsenic in them. So
Yeah.
if you like really went for the arsenic, if you really went like you just ate apple seeds for like say you ate like I don't know 100 apple seeds in a day, that could probably kill you. So
That's so
that's one
true.
way. That's one way to do it. Or eat 14 bananas. Apparently, that will overload your synapse, like
OD.
your action potentials with all the potassium. That was another thing that was rumored.
But I suppose on a deeper level, I just thought that adults knew best and they weren't just making things up as they went along. You
Yeah.
know, when you get older, you really do realize like I don't know. I had this weird conception where when you got to like 24 or something, something would just snap and you just have everything figured out. Maybe it'll happen, maybe not. It certainly hasn't happened yet.
I mean, I think you kind of get uncomfortable with the uncertainty of being an adult. You kind of
Yeah.
you get confident with the uncertainty, I think.
Mm.
Until a new problem comes along that you haven't experienced. That's kind of the way it works. But as a child, I was like convinced there was nothing cooler than like a 20-year-old. I was like, they are like
Yeah.
so cool, they're so attractive, that everyone loves it. I want to be the 20 because we go
Yeah.
and stay like some family like my godmother had much older children than me, and I just always was like in awe of them.
Yeah. I
I
mean,
always
to
thought
be
they were
fair, I would not, for the life of me, ever want to go back to being a kid. This is the other thing I was going to say. It's like films, and a lot of adults always say like, "Oh, school is like the best time of your life." It's bollocks. Like that's just not even remotely true. Like
mm,
school sucks. I would never ever want to go back.
I mean, I would probably go back, but I wouldn't go back before. I'd go back pre-puberty. I'd go back to around the age of 8. 8 was good.
I
Um,
suppose.
like before then, you don't have too much self-awareness.
Yeah.
You're not particularly self-conscious. You're quite fun and like free-lived, and people just go, oh, they're a kid, and they let you be a kid. You don't
Yeah.
have responsibilities, and everything is still a bit magical as a
Yeah.
kid. So I
That's very
would
true.
kind of stay below 8, but like 9 onwards, you can skip. I'm not too interested.
Exactly. Now, being a teenager is the worst. It's like you don't really realize it until you know what it is. It's just that you think that like, oh, if you're struggling in school, then it's gonna be that's like you're gonna struggle throughout your whole life. But it's if anything, it's like the opposite. I feel like the people who really perform well in school aren't really prepared for real life, if that makes sense. Because school
Uh,
has all these rules and stuff like that don't apply to the real world. I mean, some things do. Like if you're like extroverted and attractive, that helps you get a long way in life, as it does in
yeah.
school. But you know, it's because the people, I guess the thing is people think they almost get a weird ego, and like they think that everything is like the end of the world, like if you're not popular or something. I don't know.
No, you leave and you find your niche.
Yeah, yeah, and the
Um,
idea of like popularity just goes completely out the window when you leave school.
it does and it doesn't. I think it comes back when the concept of being popular comes back when you move into like a more like into an office or something.
Yeah, that's fair.
Um, I think it still, although it's not quite the same environment, I think quite strong contrasts between school and the office life, which is why I don't want to work in an office.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't
um,
know. I just feel like in school there was this sort of weird unwritten rule where if you tried to talk to somebody, I guess it's because you all sort of knew each other, but like if you tried to talk to somebody that wasn't really in your, I suppose,
social
social
league.
class, yeah, it was like unacceptable. But nobody cares about that stuff in the real world. Like if you talk to people and you're friendly and warm, then they're not going to be like, "Ugh, go away, loser." It's like it doesn't
That's
work like
definitely
that.
true. Like if you in fact don't go talk to them, that's considered weird.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
if you say I guess that's something different in work. It like like you would only talk to those people in school if you were assigned a project with them or something.
Yeah,
But beyond that, you would never talk to them. But in the office, if they were definitely not your cup of tea or the sort of person you normally associate with, but you have to do a job together. The end of it is the fact of the matter is you have to do a job, and if you don't do the job, you actually get in more trouble. So
yeah. No, exactly.
uh, that I guess.
Maybe we should do a school episode. That would be interesting.
Oh, we could get very dark.
We could indeed. But perhaps another time. Today we're going to be talking
Another
about something. It's slightly topical, but obviously it's an issue that's pervaded through the sands of time. The right to protest. So I guess I'll just kick off by saying that at the time of recording, a few days ago, there was a vigil for a woman named Sarah Everard, who was, I mean, I think the guy has been convicted, but essentially she was murdered by somebody who was working for the police. And there was a vigil where loads of people came and laid out candles and stuff. There was, just basically a gathering of people. And this is during COVID. So under that sort of justification, the Met Police got involved and tried to make everyone disperse, which sort of just made the situation a lot worse, and ended up in somebody getting arrested. Just a very strange turn of events, really, but certainly nothing.
It was. I mean, the way that they arrested the girl was quite violent. And she's like she said, saw on the news, I'm a 5'2" woman, and 4 policemen picked me up and pinned me to the ground. It's somewhat disproportionate.
Yeah, absolutely.
The response to the situation. Again, it is a time. There are COVID laws in place which are preventing us from this wasn't even necessarily a protest. It was a vigil. It was to show solidarity.
Right.
Since it has created especially the treatment of women. For the case of Sarah Everard, then the aggressive treatment of the police, whether or not it was during a time of state crisis or not, was disproportionate to the action, and that has led to a now protest that women are saying, we do not feel safe. Look how the police have treated us on two linked occasions.
Absolutely. This is the thing. I think the way police handle protests is the most important thing here, because really there was no need for them to act in the way that they did. It was not, like you said, it wasn't even a protest. It was just people getting together. And yes, we are in currently in a pandemic, but that doesn't mean that we should be living under a dictatorship. If I would argue, and I think most people would argue, that getting together and showing your respect for somebody, especially a crime against a woman, like there's more to it than just like a random act of violence. There's certain meaning behind that, and for people to come and show their respects is culturally significant. And just to completely say that that's not allowed under the guise of COVID-19 is very much an authoritarian move. And
go
on.
Well, this year there's been a huge surge of protest, and COVID has almost made people want to become more active with it, and protest more, probably because maybe we're frustrated and we can't do a lot of other things. So, but a lot of civic movements have come up in this time, including the Black Lives Matter case, and even trans rights has been an issue this year with the repeal of the Gender Recognition Act not being undertaken, and the rights for trans children to access hormone blockers being removed, which created some spark within the trans community. But the right to protest comes from Article 11. And it is the freedom of assembly and association, and the right to form and join trade unions, political parties and or associations, and also the right to abstain from these things. No one can pressure you to join any of these things, but also nobody is allowed to pressure you not to join these things or create these movements. The restrictions that that are in place are, if it is a threat to national security and public safety, to prevent disorder and crime, protect health and the morals of the nation, and to protect the rights and freedom of others. Those are the restriction clauses that we have. But I do feel that often with protests, people can maybe protest peacefully, but often it's only the ones that when they become the most heated and violent that change actually does occur. And it is the police often, I'd say, being out of touch with the needs for change, which actually creates greater recognition almost to the movement. Like the acts of violence that the police cause only actually fan the flames and actually make people angrier and more likely to join the movement.
Let's go a bit deep on this. So you mentioned Article 11. So specifically, that's Article 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights, if you didn't know. There's also obviously Article 10, which is the freedom of expression. I would argue those two sort of come together to establish the right to protest. Yeah, because the right to gather and the right to assembly it's part of what makes a protest a protest. I mean, it's more, this is what bothers me about, not to get too ahead of myself, but with people will say, well, I agree with the cause, but maybe they could have gone about it in a different way, or well, maybe I agree with them, but they shouldn't have blocked the roads, or they shouldn't have done it during COVID. But the thing is, like, there's nothing that quite illustrates your point than gathering together in a big group of people that it shows visibly how many people agree with you if there's so many people willing to turn up. So that's an important aspect of it, and it gets people to pay attention. I can't remember who said this, but there was something along the lines of, there's no such thing as a polite protest. There's always going to be people who, well, A, there's always going to be people who disagree with the message, but B, there's always going to be people who are annoyed just by the sight of it. The fact that you are gathering together, a lot of the times, you're causing obstructions, you're being an inconvenience to a lot of people, but that's kind of the point. Unfortunately, like the only human nature is so that the only reason a lot of the time, the only reason we pay attention to something is because it pisses us off, or because it stops our way of living. So so a good example of that would obviously be the Extinction Rebellion protest from a while ago, which even I would say that they probably went a bit too far in some aspects, but at the end of the day, everyone knew about them and they got their point across. And of course, that doesn't give you free rein to do anything, especially if it's violent. But that's really is the whole point of a protest, to get eyes on this this issue that no one's talking about.
And also to force the government to make a policy change as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Because the government will if you don't create enough noise and you don't create enough I guess discomfort to the government in power, they don't really feel the need to necessarily change it.
Absolutely.
It's only from persistent pressure will the government actually, and when they actually see that they're losing voters on this policy that they're like maintaining, will they then go around and change it because they want to stay in power.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so telling that in the news recently, there's been new proposed changes on law about women's rights that probably wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for this vigil. It's a very powerful tool, and because some things like elections are obviously, you could argue, the main component of a democratic society, but it's not the only component. Just saying that, oh, well, if you don't like somebody, then you can elect somebody else. Yeah, it doesn't really cover it. And there's a lot of people who feel like they haven't got a voice on certain issues, that they're underrepresented. Maybe because they are in the minority, but because their issue is still important. So the protests are obviously a very good way of demonstrating that. demonstrating that again, there's a lot of people who agree with them. But yeah, obviously that's that's why protests are cool and good. I don't think many people disagree with us there. I think obviously the problem comes when, well, there's a few problems, I suppose. One, when it causes inconvenience and annoyance to people. And obviously there are times when things escalate, things become violent, you know, when you have so many people, especially when you have the police there as well. So what do you think about, what do you think can be done to stop sort of, you know, gatherings and protests from becoming violent?
I think, well, there's always a risk of violence. I think, especially if something is quite contentious, like, say, for example, the EDL, the English Defence League, deciding to protest, and often that attracts people like Unite Against Fascism, and that can lead into quite a lot of fights and violence. Or traditionally, or like more historically, the gay rights protests were very violent throughout the 80s in particular. And even like in the Black Lives Matter protests more recently, there was footage of police being, I think, unreasonably violent to get towards protesters. And then also that if you were, after the protests had taken place and such, if you were a person of color at the protest, you were 54 times more likely to be fined than a white person who also attended the protest. So this does show that if you are the minority, you are still, or you are protesting, and you are you are for, like, I don't know what's the minority protesting, that's the only word I can find. You are still hugely discriminated against for your actions to protest. And I think if there aren't so that shows that there are consequences to protest. But if there aren't consequences to protests for something that you do believe in, because it's all about what you believe in, and not everyone believes in the same thing, to get about this along around. I do not agree with the EDL. I do believe with Black Lives Matter, but yeah, if the right to protest is the right to protest, no matter what your belief is. So if I say that I'm not allowed to choose which cause is more worthy, but I do think that the police need to get better at at being more unbiased in how they respond to each group protesting. That is.
Yes, there was a case a while ago. I can't remember the judge that said it, but basically it's like, yeah, if I don't agree with a protest message, then if anything, that's more of a reason for it to go ahead, because you know, like that's the whole point. And really, that you hit the nail on the head there. The police need to be neutral. As hard as it is, because you know ultimately they're not robots. They can't pretend to not have a sway one way or the other. But they need to try and sort of think about things objectively, and think not in terms of, well, I don't agree with this protest, and you think more in terms of, is this protest going to turn violent? And so I want to be specific here. An international law, at least, and of a violent protest, quote unquote, is essentially, well, specifically, it is one that involves the majority of participants becoming violent or inciting others to do violence, or like just actual hatred. So it's something like EDL. Obviously, there's sort of a gray area there, but ultimately, from what I understand, I suppose depending on how you view it, they are advocating for policy change. They're not necessarily advocating for, you know, immigrants or whatever to be beaten up or abused or anything like that. I mean, again, you can argue that there's I'm drawing an arbitrary distinction there, but you know, like you say, their opinion should be voiced, and it's up to us, the public, to decide whether or not we agree with it, not the police. And you mentioned it's interesting about counter protests. You mentioned about the EDL and whatever. It's they have
United
just as
Against,
much of a right. So what was that?
the United Against Fascism. They're
Yeah,
their big
that was
rival.
it. They have just as much of a right to be heard as the actual protest itself. And it's up to the police, I guess, to facilitate this in however best they can. And notice I said facilitate, because that is really the police's job in all this. It's not to stop protests, it's to facilitate and make sure it runs smoothly. They should be facing out, not in, basically, when they're monitoring the protest. Using yeah, go on.
Also, they should allow protests to come to their own natural I feel like, to an extent, because often there's the march and then often there's speakers afterwards. And the police should allow all speakers to speak. I've been to protests where the police have decided that they've had enough peaceful protests, had enough airtime, they're going to cut it off, and then what they then do is they then threaten the arrest of people who continue to speak, and an otherwise legal, peaceful, socially distanced, this is under COVID, which is again not the correct management of a protest. If of course it is deteriorating and breaking down into violence, that is different.
Yeah.
But if it is otherwise peaceful, they shouldn't interject.
Yeah, the police don't get to decide when it ends. And you know, you could rightfully say, I suppose, that we're expecting a lot of the police in this regard. In particular, like in international law, like I said, there's almost an obligation for police to make sure that counter protests are heard. You know, almost even to an extent heard by the original protest. And you could argue that that's sort of going against their job, because their job is to make sure that things run smoothly and peacefully. So we are kind of asking the police to do an almost impossible task. But at the very least, I suppose we should expect the police not to intervene inappropriately. They shouldn't threaten arrests for petty crimes, like, you know, minor vandalism or whatever, or breaches of the peace in heavy quotes. These things, if the police try and crack down on it, it is an abuse of our human rights. You know, however, whether it's enshrined in domestic law or not is irrelevant, really. Which I suppose leads us on to, again, a bit more topical, but right now there's a bill going through Parliament called the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill that is, well, among many other things, it would essentially give the police more powers to shut down protests that are, to quote the bill exactly, it would be protests that have severe risk of causing severe disturbance or annoyance or distress, which, you know, to me is just astonishing, because it's like that could basically apply to any protests.
Exactly.
It's absolutely ludicrous. I mean, it does feel a lot like we're regressing as a democratic society in this regard. There was so much backlash over the Black Lives Matter protests, particularly with the vandalizing of statues and all this stuff. Which is why I said earlier, like, go on.
And like in the new bill, they basically want to increase the severity of punishment for damage to property.
Yeah.
Whereas again, property is being prioritized over life, and surely life is more important than property. You can rebuild, like, even if you don't like the statue or whatever, you know, if it's, you can always rebuild the statue. You can't bring someone back from the dead, or, you know, change a life, or necessarily stop a life occurring injury. something if it becomes violent, and I don't think that should be the priority in protests.
Absolutely. There's a term I'm sure you've heard called civil disobedience, which is essentially, it's I suppose the best way to describe it is the peacefully breaking of the law in order to prove a point, you know. And obviously by definition that means you have to break the law, so therefore I suppose by extension you should be arrested and whatever, dealt with in the justice system. But there has been a huge crackdown recently in the US in particular on this sort of activity, you know, particularly of vandalism of statues or whatever. But, you know, there's obviously a key difference between, you know, setting fire to something or just randomly, you know, and desecrating a statue. There's a political implication in the latter that should be considered. And in a way, if you think about it, to treat that crime more harshly really just doubles down on this authoritarian idea, because you're basically saying, well, you can't criticize the government in a roundabout way. It's very disturbing. At least I find it disturbing.
It is rather disturbing. I mean, with Extinction Rebellion, from what I remember, they occupied tube stations and they blocked off Oxford Circus for a long period of time, and it caused mass congestion within London, and that created that. I mean, the knock-on result of that was like emergency care services and stuff were not able to function as well as usual. So that did lead to more people potentially people losing loved ones and stuff due to the protests present. So I can see that that is a major disruption to some people's lives, and I can see why that causes concern. But the term like what you said within the term annoyance is frankly not good enough reason. It's the exact reason to protest. I mean, if with regards to serious disruption, like yes, what Extinction Rebellion did by occupying caused it, but also in London we've had tube strikes. The tube strikes completely decimate London, and they last for, you know, they can last for a day, they can last for a week, they cause a lot of problems, yet everyone still manages to get on with it, and yet we all grumble about it. But the protest was pretty much on a similar scale, and I don't see the problem. I don't see that a problem.
Yeah, no, and you know, ultimately, whenever they protest, it's people, you know, it's for a good reason a lot of the time. Like, you can't get that many people together under a cause that just has no merit, is the way I look at it. You know, you can disagree with the Extinction Rebellion's method, which I already said I do disagree with that specific aspect of it, where yes, they've cut off a lot of emergency services, but everything else, I mean, I think it's fair game. And there were so many people involved, like a huge number of people. You can't just sweep that under the rug. Like, that's being undemocratic at that point, because you're not representing a huge part of your country, of your demos. You know, it's frankly like unacceptable. Especially when you look at like America, you know, just the way they've dealt with it. They basically completely tried to vilify the Black Lives Matter protesters, which again came out in huge numbers. And even like major companies, as cringy as it was, they were coming out in favor of the protests. So you can't just say that these are like, you know, criminals and vandals and anarchists or whatever. It's a huge number of people that feel strongly about a certain way. And I guess my roundabout way is of getting to that point is, yeah, it's like the protest should open up a dialogue, or at the very least that they should open your eyes, the public's eyes, to an issue that you might not have been aware of, because there's no other way really to bring it to the forefront. And to respond in a authoritarian, you know, crackdown type way really is inappropriate because you're trying to re-silence voices at that point, you know.
Mm.
You're trying, yeah, you're trying to just, like I said, sweep the problem under the rug.
One of the more recent sort of protests I've seen posters of around bus stations is the anti-maskers protests during COVID, and the anti-maskers, anti-vaccination protests, which is something I find personally quite dangerous and I disagree with quite strongly, because I feel like although you don't have to, you have your own the NHS has made it clear, if you don't want the vaccine, you don't have to have the vaccine. It's part of the ethical code of care in medicine. Even if refusing treatment might cause you more harm, that the NHS or a doctor cannot prescribe you care you do not consent to. Yeah, these people are breaking social distancing rules and also not wearing protection in name of protest. So that is something I find quite challenging to like kind of allow to go forward, because I feel like these people are actually causing the continuation of the pandemic.
No, that's very fair. That's very fair enough. I mean, it's like I completely am in agreement with you there. They're causing quite a risk to the people around them. The only thing I would say is, again, it's like I would rather know if that many people were so against it. I would rather be in the know of that. Not necessarily because the response to every protest can't be policy change, because sometimes it's not appropriate. Like in this case, it would be inappropriate for the government to cave and say, oh, okay, fine, don't wear a mask, whatever. Like that's just silly. But that maybe we can again open up some sort of dialogue, maybe try and educate these people. Like you say, there's nothing saying that you have to have the vaccine. It's only that if you don't. The only thing I've read that is like, oh, if you don't have the vaccine, it might be that you can't do certain things, which is obviously very reasonable.
I think that's another thing that they're protesting about, the right for, say, employers and stuff to have access to your medical history. Yet many places, when you go to work, they will do an occupational health check on you, so they do have access to your health. They'll ask you, do you have any learning disabilities? They will ask you, do you have asthma? They will ask you, do you have any access requirements or things like that? So that is, you actually get asked those things anyway a lot in the workplace. I mean, you have to do that if you're going to be a teacher, if you're going to work in healthcare, if you're going to do a job that requires that you walk a lot or something. These are all questions that get asked anyway. So I don't think it's really, I don't think, well, I disagree with, again, another point in that argument, but
but it's reasonable for people to be concerned about these things.
It is reasonable.
Like I don't want particularly my employer know my medical history. I think that's a pretty valid thing to be concerned about. But yeah, like I say, it doesn't mean that we should necessarily take everything they say into account. But again, I would rather know. I wouldn't. My response, I guess, wouldn't be to just send the police in there, which, funnily enough, seems to be the way that the government operates. It has to be said. Like protests like this, again, particularly in America, all these pro-Trump anti-vaxxers were met with like 2 police coming out and monitoring them. And as soon as the Black Lives Matter protests came out, it was, basically the full US Army, the National Guard. It's very it's very apparent that like where the government stands on the matter has a big impact on how seriously they treat the protest. Yeah. I should say as well, like the other thing about the bill, they were saying about restricting protests in London. Again, under international law, this isn't like you can't just ban permanently having any sort of demonstration in a certain time or place.
Yeah.
Like you can say at a specific place and time that it's not allowed if there's a valid reason. However, you can't just say you can't have a protest outside Parliament, for example.
Well,
That's not
yeah, I
allowed.
mean that's undemocratic because London is where the House of Democracy is in the UK,
Yeah.
and to say you cannot protest at the site of democracy is undemocratic.
You gotta remember as well, like, yes, a lot of these protests have a lot of people that come, but ultimately the police are always going to always going to have the upper ground. And you really have to think about that. The idea that the police could somehow be overwhelmed. I mean, it does happen in very rare occasions, I suppose, but the default should be that it is the police that is the aggressor, or at the very least that the police, they're not going to suddenly be overwhelmed by a bunch of hippies chanting about the environment. That's just not good. That's just not how it happens. Like, there's this weird conception that like the Black Lives Matter protest was specifically like, oh, they were like had Molotov cocktails and like guns, and like, they were dangerous somehow. It just doesn't happen like that.
No. So would you maybe suggest that there be a special part of the police force or another faction entirely together that was responsible for dealing with protests?
That would be good. I suppose practically, well, I suppose most protests do happen around London. I think in London specifically, yeah. For the rest of Britain, it doesn't really happen often enough. What I would instead ask for is education on this sort of thing. And I don't mean the education they have currently, which is how to break up a protest. I mean, what are your powers when you should not use it, which is most of the time. When is it acceptable to use any sort of force? Again, not most of the time. All of this stuff is very important. And I guess even I suppose above and beyond that, it goes back to there should be better cultural and ethics training in the police, because a lot of this just comes down to biases. The police have the Met specifically of classic criticisms of racism, so many scandals against them. There needs
And
to be
sex.
sexism. There needs to be better standards for who gets to become a police officer, who represents the country, really. That's who they are. Then they shouldn't just be a bunch of bullies with batons.
No, I mean, at the protests I have attended, the presence of the police personally has never been a calming thing. It has always set me on edge instead.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
One protest I went to in September, I was given a card. I don't have it, but it was basically about my right to the police intercept, and they are trying to arrest me. What should I do in order to basically minimize my risk of harm from the police?
Yeah.
Which I think is something that protesters should know.
It's very poignant that you had to be told that.
Like, I don't have to give like things like I'm in no ways entitled to give my name, to give my contact details, to give my address to the police because I have decided to protest. That is probably the most important. If I am arrested, I am entitled to a lawyer. Things like, these are things that
Should
police will
never.
try and
Yeah, go on.
these are things that the police will try and like almost like infer you don't have access to, or you don't have the right to, that they are entitled to know, when that's not true.
Yeah.
I
guess this is some practical advice. It's particularly if you're arrested at a demonstration or a protest, you should always ask what you're being arrested for. That usually helps because there's not normally a good reason a lot of the time. But beyond that, you should stay completely silent, and you should say, I want a lawyer. You should not answer any of their questions until you get a lawyer, because a lot of the time then they'll just drop it. And they'll say things like, oh, you won't be able to get one for like hours. You gotta stand your ground. because I don't know, this is slightly off topic, but there's a weird misconception that if you want a lawyer present, that you're guilty, you know, and that he's going to help you finesse out of being charged. But really, the reason why it's a legal requirement for you to have a lawyer is because most people don't know like the ins and outs of the legal system. You could say stuff that you just don't have to say, and then they could violate your human rights without you even knowing. And this is why you need a solicitor there. But
Definitely.
yeah, I suppose to wrap it up, I would encourage anybody, if you, like you said, I think activism has been on the rise recently, and I think that's kind of a good thing. I think that people are fed up with just not having their voices heard. I think if you believe strongly in something, and if you don't feel like your views are being represented, well, first of all, you should vote, but beyond that, you should get involved in any way you can. There's almost always, if you're thinking something, there's probably a good chance that someone else is as well. Just get out there and take a look.
Yeah, and go to a protest.
Yeah,
they're quite fun.
Get involved. Honestly, like protest. If you go to a protest, the protests are all about numbers, because numbers help convey what I was saying earlier. It's so many people agree and believe a certain way. If you see a protest and you think, oh, I agree with that, then go. Like you're helping directly just by turning up, and you don't have to say anything. You don't have to like bring placards. You don't have to do anything. You just have to be there. That's the beauty of it.
No, use your and if something does concern you, write to your MP. You know, create a political movement, create or whatever to make your change heard. Get active on social media. Oh, this is actually a point I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, go on.
During the BLM protests, a number of Black Lives Matter activists in the UK were emailed, monitored, and accounts were shut down by the police.
Yeah.
Is this? Do the police have the right to monitor? I guess organization online.
Nope. Like and under international human rights law, they absolutely not. This is obviously a much bigger debate on the right to privacy. But yeah, there's even technology that was used, I believe, in what you're talking about in the US, the Black Lives Matter protest, there was facial recognition technology that was used on the actual protesters themselves. So even if, you know, they basically, the police knew who a lot of the people who were at the protests were. And obviously, beyond being a huge breach of your privacy, this is very harmful to the right to protest. It discourages people from discussing issues online, you know, airing their thoughts, their grievances. Again, we are sort of getting closer and closer to a Black Mirror dystopian future scenario where we can't discuss thoughts and feelings and we can't demonstrate our opinions. It's very scary.
The thought police are coming.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I was going to say, what you were saying earlier, write to your MP, be a nuisance. If you want change, you have to be annoying. You have to pester people. Can't be nice.
Harness your inner toddler.
Yep, literally. Because I'm sure we've all experienced this before. You know, it's like you're not inclined to do anything. You're not inclined to go out of your way to do stuff unless it's of benefit to you, really. And that's certainly how the government feels. So, you know, badger your MP, say you won't stop messaging them until you've got some sort of resolution. Talk to others, start a podcast like this. If we can do it, then bloody hell, anyone can. But yeah, were there any final thoughts you had?
No, I think that was my final brain pop, if you like. Yeah.
Sound. Yes. Get involved, get active. do stuff,
But don't
and
hurt people.
but don't hurt people, obviously. That never helps. It only ever hurts. Only ever hurts your image, obviously.
Yeah.
Hence why everyone is mistrustful of the police. So
Exactly.
yeah, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.